"Oh, I can prove it," I said, my voice sharp and cold like a blade slicing through the stifling air. I pulled another stack of documents from my briefcase, bank records exposing mysterious sums of money flowing into her shell company after each desperate property sale, emails detailing plans to force out those who didn't belong to the HOA. And my favorite, the messages she'd sent herself, scheming how to make the electrical fire look like an innocent accident. Each sheet of paper was a hammer blow crashing down on the corrupt empire she'd built on the pain of people like me, a black woman daring to resist her oppression. The room erupted in gasps and stunned whispers. Karen Holliday's hands trembled, coffee sloshing over the rim of her cup, spilling onto the floor in scalding streaks. "This is utter nonsense," she shrieked, her voice shrill with a mix of panic. "You can't barge in here and throw around these insane accusations. I'll sue you for slander, you'll pay dearly, you lowlife." That was the cue I'd been waiting for. I reached into my briefcase one last time and pulled out a judge's robe. The jet-black silk unfurled like a victory banner as I draped it over myself, each fold falling with an undeniable majesty. "Federal Judge Zora Ellison," I declared, my voice resounding like a final verdict, my eyes locked on Karen's face as the blood drained from it, leaving a deathly pallor. "Currently presiding over case number 2026 CR 319, United States versus Holliday and co-conspirators, a RICO investigation into corruption, fraud, and criminal conspiracy targeting people like me. People you thought didn't deserve to exist in your pure neighborhood." The coffee cup slipped from Karen's grasp, shattering on the floor with a piercing crash, porcelain shards scattering like the collapse of her empire. The scalding liquid splashed onto her designer shoes, but she didn't notice, her mouth gaped open, flapping like a fish dragged onto shore, unable to utter a word. "FBI." It all began with a spark, not from an actual flame, but from the defiant glint in the eyes of someone who thought they could crush me with a single arrogant wave of their hand. The sound of breaking glass, the stench of smoke, and the price of that arrogance drew me into a battle I never expected. That's how I made Karen Holliday and her cronies face the nightmare they'd created themselves. Leave a comment with the number 9 to let us know you're ready to dive into the gripping whirlwind of this story. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the breathtaking moments waiting ahead. I am Zora Ellison, 38 years old, a black woman born in the parched lands of Selma, Texas, where my grandmother once toiled in textile mills to feed our family amidst the harsh lines of racial segregation. Now, I'm a civil rights attorney working out of a small but fiercely determined office in downtown Boise, Idaho. I moved here 12 years ago, carrying a hunger to build a free life and protect the legacy my grandmother, the woman who taught me that skin color isn't a shackle but a badge of strength, left behind. The Victorian house at number 418 Cedarstone Street, with its vibrant emerald green paint, is all I have from her, a stronghold once for black folks fleeing Southern oppression in the 1950s. To me, it's not just a shelter, it's a declaration that I have the right to exist, no matter who seeks to deny it. The morning started as usual. I sat on my grandmother's 130-year-old porch swing, sipping coffee as the dawn painted the sky with streaks of pink above the emerald green Victorian. That's when I saw her, Karen Holliday, striding arrogantly toward my mailbox, clutching an envelope like it was the key to an empire. I'd grown used to that icy stare from the neighborhood meetings she held in the newly built mansion next to my home, a stark, soulless white structure that stood like a proclamation of dominance. My stomach tightened as Karen dropped the envelope into my mailbox and lingered, snapping photos of my front yard with her phone like a predator marking its prey. My grandmother's sunflowers were in full bloom, their wild beauty a stark contrast to Karen's meticulously trimmed, mechanical shrubs. I knew she despised every free petal, not just because they disrupted the order she craved, but because they belonged to me, a black woman daring to hold onto something beautiful in the neighborhood she claimed as her domain. The envelope held what she called a rare privilege, an official invitation to join their newly formed Homeowners Association, HOA, complete with a glossy pamphlet showcasing identical cream-colored houses and matching mailboxes. The entry fee was $7,000 plus $420 monthly. But what made my hands tremble wasn't the cost, it was the attached list of mandatory renovations. Repaint all unapproved colors, including the emerald green shade my grandmother had mixed by hand. Replace the historic sunflower garden with regulation-compliant plants. Remove the ancient steel wind chimes that had hummed gently every night for 28 years. Through the window, I watched Karen stride back to her house, phone pressed to her ear. "Yes, I just delivered the final offer," she said, her voice syrupy with menace. "She can't resist it." That house is the last thing standing in the way of Cedarstone Street. Once we force it to conform, property values will skyrocket. No one wants to live next to an eyesore like that, especially not one owned by her kind. The phrase her kind landed hard, a slash at my skin, and I heard my grandmother's voice echo in my mind. They don't hate the house, Zora. They hate that you dare to stand tall here. That night, I crossed to Karen's house with the envelope in hand. Her doorbell chimed the smug tune of Dixie. No surprise there. She opened the door, sporting a neighborhood guardian badge. Flashing a smile she must have thought would bring me to my knees. I've considered your offer, I said, keeping my voice steady with 16 years of courtroom grit. I decline. This house has been in my family for 5 generations, and I'll defend its historical value. Karen's smile vanished faster than wind over dry plains. You don't get it. She leaned in, her voice icy. This isn't an offer you can refuse. The HOA is legally registered. Your house is surrounded by our people. You're joining, whether you want to keep that trash heap or not. Her words weren't just a command. They were a claim that, to her, I had no right to refuse, not because of the law, but because of my skin. I pulled out the property deed I'd studied all day. Actually, you're wrong. My title predates any HOA agreement, and the law doesn't force me to join. 16 years fighting for the oppressed had taught me that preparation is the strongest shield against an enemy. Karen's face burned red like glowing coals. Listen here, she growled, shedding her polite facade entirely. This neighborhood is moving forward. We're bringing real order. If you don't fall in line, things will get ugly. Old houses like yours are prone to trouble, fires, code violations, crippling fines. Maybe you should learn your place before this goes too far. Her threat carried the echo of every time I'd been warned, don't step out of line, just for being black. A sting far too familiar. I locked eyes with her, unblinking. Is that a threat, Mrs. Holliday? She stepped back, her fake smile sliding back into place like a flimsy curtain. Oh no, I'm just concerned about property values and your safety. Old houses like this are prone to problems. Faulty wiring, collapsing walls. It'd be a shame if something happened just because you cling to that outdated legacy, especially with your background. The word background slipped out like a curse, aimed straight at my identity. Behind her, I saw her husband at the window, phone in hand, his gaze sharp as a blade. The way he stared at me brought back memories of being tailed by cops just for daring to walk through a neighborhood not meant for people like me. A chilling feeling that never left me. I gave a slight nod and turned away, but Karen's voice rang out behind me. 12 days, she shouted. You have 12 days to reconsider before the HOA board meets to discuss stronger measures. On my way back, I noticed eyes peering from other windows. Karen's HOA allies, no doubt. Instinct told me this wouldn't end easily. That night, I installed security cameras around the house, meticulously documenting every detail of the present state. I'd learned long ago to trust my gut, and now it was screaming that Karen Holliday was just getting started. What I didn't know then was that this fight wasn't just about property values or emerald green paint. In 16 years of facing injustice and prejudice, I'd never met anyone like Karen. A woman who didn't just want to raise my house but erase the very presence of a black woman like me from her pure neighborhood. As I drifted to sleep with the gentle hum of the steel wind chimes, I had no idea this was only the beginning of a war that would change everything. My beloved Victorian home would become the first casualty, but Karen had made a grave mistake in targeting me. She didn't know I wasn't just a survivor of scornful glares. I was a warrior forged to reclaim justice, and I wouldn't let her win easily. The next morning, I was jolted awake by Karen yelling outside my window. Look at that hideous green. It's polluting this respectable neighborhood. I pulled the curtains aside and saw her leading a group of HOA members in what they called a morning patrol. My heart sank as they snapped photos of every inch of my grandmother's cherished home. I tried sitting on the porch with my coffee, but their whispers carried across the lawn. Did you see those rusty wind chimes? Not up to HOA standards. And those sunflowers, for inches taller than regulation. Each day, their complaints grew more absurd. They started slapping bright purple warning notices on my door, listing violations no one cared about before the HOA existed. The historic sunflower garden my grandmother planted by hand was suddenly a community hazard. The Victorians' emerald green paint, once a neighborhood icon, became their biggest target. I knew their critiques masked more than an obsession with rules. It was hostility toward a black woman like me, daring to hold onto something vibrant and distinct in a world they wanted to paint a uniform, faded shade. One Thursday morning, I caught Karen Holiday measuring the grass in my yard with a tape measure. 14.2 inches, she crowed triumphantly to her lackey, a woman named Lenora Tate, who scribbled in a notebook like she'd uncovered the crime of the century. 6.2 inches over standard. This doesn't deserve to exist in our civilized neighborhood. I stepped outside, coffee in hand, fighting to stay calm despite the rage boiling inside. You're trespassing on private property, I said firmly, leaning on my legal knowledge but keeping my profession under wraps. Karen just smirked, her eyes cutting like daggers, and kept snapping photos. But that was only the start. Her harassment quickly turned into a systematic campaign. They hired lawn crews to show up at exactly 6 in the morning on Saturdays, the roar of mowers thundering under my bedroom window like they meant to wake my ancestors. Anonymous complaints to the city piled up twice a week. Each time, I calmly presented paperwork proving the house's historic status, watching Karen fume from her window, face flushed with fury as inspectors left empty-handed. They shifted to psychological tactics, more vicious than I'd imagined. Karen held HOA meetings right on the sidewalk in front of my home office, her voice booming through the walls. Some stubborn holdouts are dragging down this neighborhood's reputation. Outdated houses like these need to be dealt with for the good of decent people. The word decent was emphasized, a pointed reminder that I, a black woman, didn't belong here in their eyes. My security cameras caught their brazen acts. They let loose a dog, a massive hound named Brutus, to relieve itself on my lawn, then feigned shock when I showed the footage. Oh my precious Brutus would never, Karen exclaimed, clutching her chest like a stage actress, even as the dog left another gift right before my eyes. I knew it wasn't just disrespect, it was a message that they saw me as little more than trash to be swept away. The breaking point came at the annual neighborhood barbecue, where I was publicly excluded from the guest list. Standing on my porch, I heard Karen declare to the crowd, certain old properties, she shot a glance at my house, her eyes sharp as a blade, no longer fit our community's vision. We'll revitalize this area soon, one way or another. I noticed strangers snapping photos of my house's foundation, whispering about structural issues. My heart pounded, but I stayed calm, documenting everything. Every warning letter, every photo, every baseless complaint. I organized them meticulously, like a lawyer preparing for the trial of a lifetime. When they installed blinding security lights aimed straight at my bedroom windows, I added light pollution to my growing file. My grandmother once taught me that patience is power, and as Karen's crew grew bolder, I knew my counterstrike had to be perfectly timed. That night, reviewing camera footage, I uncovered something chilling. 2 HOA board members, Otis Granger and Calvin Drew, were sneaking around my property's boundary markers, murmuring about land use regulations. Their eyes, the look of men accustomed to abusing power, sent a chill through my blood. They were plotting something bigger, but what? They didn't know that 16 years as a lawyer had taught me how to handle those who think they're above the law. As I turned off the porch light that evening, I saw Karen's group huddled on her sidewalk, whispering like a band of conspirators. I wondered how long I should wait before showing them they'd picked the wrong foe, a black woman who didn't just endure, but fought back. But I didn't expect things to escalate so quickly. At midnight, when I got up for water, the kitchen light spilled into the yard, and I froze at the sight of Karen, Otis, and Calvin lurking around my property. My heart stopped as I saw the chemical sprayer in their hands, aimed straight at my grandmother's 120-year-old sunflower garden, a legacy my family had safeguarded through generations. "What are you doing?" I yelled from the porch, my phone already recording, my voice trembling with fury. Karen flinched but quickly regained her composure, a fake smile spreading like an oil slick. "Oh, we're just clearing out these weeds," she said, her voice sickly sweet, still spraying the flowers. "The HOA has strict pest control rules. If you joined, we wouldn't have to do this, but I guess you don't grasp the value of uniformity, do you?" I stepped closer, blood boiling but voice steady. "Those aren't weeds, Karen. Those are Victorian sunflowers planted by my grandmother in 1958. I have the original deeds and a certificate from the Botanical Preservation Society." Otis and Calvin backed off, looking uneasy, but Karen didn't flinch. Oh, someone complained they stank, she shrugged, adjusting her designer pajamas, and these thorny things threaten kids walking by. A clean neighborhood doesn't need trash like this, especially from people like you. On my private property? Behind my fence. I snapped, flipping on the security lights to full blaze. The boundary's clear and you're trespassing. Just then, Karen's husband, a man named Rufus, emerged from the shadows. A retired sheriff, he carried the air of someone used to bullying others. Calm down, he said, his voice low but laced with menace. No need to throw accusations around. We're just maintaining neighborhood standards. No one wants to live next to a mess caused by people like you. The phrase people like you landed like a curse aimed squarely at my skin. I glanced across the street and saw old Mrs. Elsie Monroe, my elderly neighbor, peeking through her curtains. She'd been coerced into joining the HOA 6 weeks ago after similar late-night visits. Her beautiful rock garden had been replaced with bland shrubs on Karen's orders within days. The next morning, my sunflowers were dead, their once vibrant petals now black and wilted. But Karen had made a fatal mistake. She'd unwittingly exposed the HOA's systematic pattern of targeting those who wouldn't submit, especially black people like me. I spent my lunch break at the county recorder's office uncovering that every home that had refused the HOA faced mysterious accidents or relentless fines until the owners sold. That afternoon, I installed additional high-definition cameras cleverly hidden among the remaining shrubs. That evening, Karen led a group of strangers, likely investors, past my house. Don't worry, this ugly thing will be gone soon, she declared, her voice carrying. We have ways of dealing with stubborn types, especially her kind. The next week was a barrage of unrelenting harassment. My mailbox was smashed 4 times. Anonymous noise complaints arrived on days I was out of town on business. City inspectors showed up daily, finding nothing but returning like a looming threat. My trash bins vanished only to be discovered violating HOA rules at the street corner. I documented it all, building my case in silence, but Karen's crew grew bolder. They started holding HOA meetings right in front of my house, criticizing every imagined flaw in front of prospective new residents. This house is tanking property values, Karen proclaimed, brandishing her expensive handbag, but rest assured it won't be a problem much longer. We don't tolerate misfits. The word misfits rang out like an insult aimed straight at my identity. The final line was crossed one rainy afternoon when I caught them sabotaging my historic fence posts, carefully loosening them while pretending to measure the sidewalk. Security footage captured Karen Holiday directing her minions, her voice as cold as an executioner's command. When these posts fail inspection, she'll have to replace the whole fence with our approved design. It'll cost tens of thousands unless she gets on her knees and joins the HOA. The smirk on her lips couldn't hide her contempt for me, a black woman daring to hold onto something outside her civilized world. That night, reviewing the footage, I spotted a horrifying detail. The HOA's inspection team always included a man secretly photographing my electrical box, gas lines, and water system. They were systematically cataloging every vulnerability in my home, like predators preparing for the kill. Why? The pieces started falling into place, painting a picture that froze my blood. I knew I had to act fast, but I couldn't tip my hand too soon. What I didn't know then was that Karen had set in motion a sinister plan that would turn my worst fears into reality, a plan aimed directly at my existence. My hands trembled as I held the morning paper, reading the headline about sentencing a corrupt real estate mogul to 18 years in prison. The courtroom was dead silent when my clerk, a young woman named Talia Brooks, burst through the door, her face pale as death. "Judge, your house, it's on fire." Those 6 words stopped my heart. I tore off my black robe and raced down the courthouse stairs, my chest pounding like it might burst. 22 minutes, that's how long it took me to drive home, but each second stretched like a century. From 5 blocks away, I saw the thick black smoke rising, my stomach turning to ice. The vibrant emerald green paint my grandmother had painstakingly mixed was now being devoured by roaring red flames. I slammed on the brakes in front of my burning home, firefighters battling the fire's fury. Waves of searing heat slammed into my face like a punch, and I heard the ancient timbers groaning under the fire's destruction. Everything my family had built over 5 generations was vanishing before my eyes, not just a house, but a legacy of black resilience through centuries of oppression. Through tears, I saw Karen standing on her driveway, clad in designer yoga gear, sipping high-end coffee like she was watching a street performance. Her perfectly styled blonde hair glinted in the sun as she chatted with her HOA cronies. They didn't bother hiding their vicious glee, whispering and pointing at each burning piece of my home as if it were a trophy of their conquest. The fire captain, a man named Hector Valdez, approached, his face grim. "Ma'am, it looks like an electrical fire. Old houses like this often have hazardous wiring." But I knew the truth. Just yesterday, I'd had the electrical system routinely inspected. Everything was up to code, as it had been every year, because I'd taken precautions after Karen's threats about unsafe, outdated homes at the last neighborhood meeting. This wasn't an accident, it was a deliberate attack. Security cameras. The thought struck me like lightning. I pulled out my phone, hands trembling so much I nearly dropped it, desperate to review the footage. The screen was blank. The cameras had stopped working at 2:30 in the morning, exactly 5 hours before the fire erupted. This wasn't random, it was evidence of a meticulously planned conspiracy. Watching my house burn, memories flooded back like a knife slicing through my heart. Days baking cookies with my grandmother in that kitchen, my law school graduation party in the garden, the first day I donned a judge's robe, all reduced to ashes because I refused to bow to Karen's damned HOA. Through the crowd of neighbors, I spotted two familiar faces. Otis Granger and Calvin Drew, HOA board members, blending into the onlookers as if uninvolved. But their distinctive work boots, identical to the ones I'd seen on footage last week when my sunflower garden was destroyed, were now caked with fresh mud, or perhaps ash from my own home. Karen approached, her face masked with feigned concern. "Oh, this is just awful," she sighed, her voice so sickeningly sweet it repulsed me. "If only you joined the HOA, we have such strict safety standards. But you insisted on clinging to that tattered past so typical of your kind." The phrase "your kind" dripped out like an insult, aimed squarely at my skin, as she took a slow sip of her coffee. I bit my lip until it bled, holding back my rage. Not yet. I couldn't play my hand. Instead, I watched as she pulled out her phone, typing rapidly. Minutes later, I overheard a neighbor whisper about a prime lot just listed on a private real estate group. Timing too perfect to be coincidence. The firefighters finally contained the blaze, but it was too late. The beautiful Victorian windows were shattered, the hand-carved porch railing charred beyond recognition, and half the roof had collapsed. 120 years of history destroyed in mere hours. Standing amid the ashes, I vowed to turn this pain into fuel. As Karen spread rumors around the neighborhood that I'd burned my own house for insurance money, a racist smear meant to tarnish a black woman like me, I quietly pulled every thread to unravel her empire. The first break came from an old law school friend, now a real estate investigator named Jamal Kendrick. He uncovered a chilling detail. Every mysterious house fire in this county over the past 7 years had been sold to the same shell company, registered under Karen's sister-in-law. My hands shook as I dug into ownership records, each page revealing a pattern of corruption too blatant to be chance. I hired a private investigator, a man named Leon Carver, to interview former neighbors who'd lost their homes. Their stories mirrored mine. Join the HOA or face harassment, followed by mysterious accidents or fires. Most had given up, selling for pennies to Karen's investment group. A widowed elderly man broke down sobbing as he recounted losing all his family photos in a suspicious garage fire, just one day after rejecting the HOA. The big breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Karen's former treasurer, a woman named Marisol Vega, who contacted me through my attorney. In a quiet diner 2 towns away, she handed me a USB with 7 years of HOA financial records, her hands trembling as she explained how Karen forced her to falsify books, threatening to report her undocumented status if she didn't comply. The records showed millions of dollars in mystery cash flowing in after each accidental fire, clear proof of a corrupt network. I stayed up countless nights connecting the dots. Rufus, Karen's husband, wasn't just a retired cop. He'd been a fire investigator. Every suspicious fire in the area had been swiftly ruled an accident by him, unquestioned. Insurance companies had paid out tens of millions based on his reports. Standing in the ruins of my grandmother's house, I realized this wasn't just personal. It was a fight against a system of abuse targeting people like me, black folks daring to hold on to our heritage. Karen thought she'd won, thought she'd broken me, but she didn't know she'd ignited a storm. I grabbed my phone and made 3 calls, one to my friend at the FBI, one to a contact in the state prosecutor's office, and one to Leon Carver. I saw Karen glance at me as I dialed, a flicker of unease crossing her smug face. Good. Let her worry. Because even though my house was ash, my true strength lay in justice, the justice I'd sworn to deliver, not just for me, but for everyone she'd crushed. My security cameras didn't just capture the arsonists. They also recorded monthly closed-door meetings at Karen Holliday's house with a pack of real estate developers drooling to turn our historic homes into luxury high-rise condos. One of them, his voice dripping with arrogance, bragged, "I've stuffed cash into the pockets of some city council guys. Once we secure enough land, the zoning laws will flip, no one can stop us." His words echoed in my mind, cold as a death sentence for my family's legacy. I traced Karen's criminal pattern, targeting prime location homes, especially irreplaceable historic properties. She used HOA rules to torment owners, escalating to sabotage and threats. If that failed, mysterious accidents delivered the killing blow. Then her crew swooped in to rescue desperate homeowners, buying properties for next to nothing before flipping them to developers for tens of millions. It wasn't just greed, it was a systematic campaign to erase people like me, black folks daring to hold onto our past in a neighborhood she aimed to whiten. Working late into the night under dim lamplight, I uncovered irrefutable evidence in the old county archives. Karen had pulled the scheme before. For other historic neighborhoods in nearby counties had met the same fate over the past 9 years. She'd move in, establish an HOA, drive out unyielding homeowners, especially people of color, then sell the consolidated land to developers for exorbitant profits. The height of her audacity, she'd even received a community improvement award from local officials, a slap in the face to the victims she'd robbed blind. The evidence was damning, but I needed a knockout blow. I convinced the FBI to wire Marisol Vega, Karen's former treasurer, for a meeting with her. The recording captured everything, Karen boasting about her next targets, laughing as she discussed which house would have wiring issues, and threatening to make Marisol disappear from this country if she dared speak. A racist warning targeting Marisol's undocumented status. That voice wasn't just an abuser of power, it was the roar of a rotten system. Each day, I watched Karen strut around the neighborhood plotting her next move while I quietly built my case. She had no idea that every arrogant wave, every fake condolence about my tragic accident was meticulously documented by me. Her smugness would be the Achilles heel that brought her down. The final piece fell into place when I uncovered the real reason she targeted my home. In the city archives, I found a secret map of a new highway expansion project. Karen's developer cronies had inside info from bribed officials. My house was the linchpin for their plan to build a shopping complex worth hundreds of millions of dollars. They'd bought up the surrounding land through shell companies, but my property was the critical link. Without it, their massive project would collapse like a house of cards. As I compiled evidence for the FBI, Karen's desperation grew palpable. She filed daily complaints about my ugly mess, now just a pile of ash, her tone dripping with contempt, as if I didn't deserve to own anything in this neighborhood because of my skin. At her peak, she proposed a special HOA fee to clean up my lot, the money funneling straight into her pocket as a reward for her ruthlessness. She didn't know each move only thickened the criminal file I held. I stood outside the community center, heart pounding like a war drum, watching Karen Holliday stride in with her usual swagger, clutching her signature coffee cup and a stack of papers. Tonight's HOA meeting wouldn't be business as usual. After 8 months of painstaking preparation in the shadows, I'd show her she'd messed with the wrong person. Through the window, I saw her setting up a PowerPoint, no doubt filled with fabricated violations and invented rules. My hand trembled slightly as it brushed the folded judge's robe in my briefcase, the FBI wire beneath my jacket, a reminder that every detail had to be flawless. The property at number 418 Cedarstone Street has been declared a public nuisance, Karen's voice echoed through the room as I silently pushed the door open and stepped inside. Under our emergency authority, we'll proceed with redevelopment plans immediately. No one wants the trash heap tainting this neighborhood any longer. A murmur of unease rippled through the room. Decent neighbors, once too afraid to oppose her, shifted in their plastic chairs, eyes flickering with doubt. Any objections? Karen smirked, her beady eyes scanning the room like a hawk hunting prey. None? Well then, let me introduce our brilliant plan. I object, Mrs. Holliday, my voice sliced through the air like a sharpened blade. All eyes turned to the entrance. I walked slowly down the center aisle, my heels clicking evenly on the tile floor like a countdown to judgment. Karen's smile faltered for a moment. but she quickly regained her fake composure. "Oh, look who's here," she sneered, her voice honeyed with venom. "Finally ready to surrender? That charred wreck of yours really is a blight on this neighborhood. We're doing you a favor. Maybe you should thank us instead of resisting, so typical of your kind." She took a long sip of coffee, that arrogant grin recalling the moment she stood watching my house burn. I opened my briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of files. "Actually, I'm here to present some evidence of my own," I said, my tone calm but icy. I spread the photos across the table one by one. "My security cameras still caught you and your crew on my property the night of the fire. Interesting timing, don't you think?" Karen's face twitched, a flash of panic in her eyes. "Anyone can fake that stuff," she snapped, struggling to maintain her cool. "You can't prove anything." "Oh, I can prove it," I said, my voice sharp and cold like a blade cutting through the stifling air. I pulled another stack of documents from my briefcase. Bank records exposing mysterious funds flowing into her shell company after each desperate property sale, emails detailing plans to force out non-HOA residents, and my favorite, her own text messages, plotting how to make the electrical fire look like an innocent accident. Each sheet was a hammer blow smashing the corrupt empire she'd built on the pain of people like me. A black woman daring to defy her oppression. The room erupted in gasps and stunned whispers. Karen Holliday's hands shook, coffee sloshing over the rim of her cup, spilling onto the floor in scalding streaks. "This is utter nonsense," she shrieked, her voice shrill with panic. "You can't barge in here and throw around these insane accusations. I'll sue you for slander. You'll pay dearly, you lowlife." That was the signal I'd been waiting for. I reached into my briefcase one last time and pulled out my judge's robe. The jet black silk unfurled like a victory banner as I draped it over myself, each fold falling with undeniable majesty. "Federal Judge Zora Ellison?" I declared, my voice resounding like a final verdict. My eyes locked on Karen's face as the blood drained from it, leaving a deathly pallor. "Currently presiding over case number 2026 CR 319, United States versus Holliday and co-conspirators, a RICO investigation into corruption, fraud, and criminal conspiracy targeting people like me. People you thought didn't deserve to exist in your pure neighborhood." Karen's coffee cup slipped from her grasp, shattering on the floor with a piercing crash, porcelain shards scattering like the collapse of her empire. The scalding liquid splashed onto her designer shoes, but she didn't notice. Her mouth gaped, flapping like a fish dragged ashore, unable to speak. "FBI!" No one moved, just as I'd scripted it in my mind. FBI agents stormed in through both main doors, badges raised high, their footsteps thundering like a storm. Rufus, Karen's husband, the former sheriff who'd buried dozens of investigation reports, bolted toward the emergency exit in a panic. He didn't make it 5 steps before 2 agents tackled him to the floor, his pained groan echoing through the chaos. I stepped closer to Karen, now slumped in her prized chairperson's seat, her face ashen like the ruins she'd left behind. "Do you know the biggest mistake criminals make?" I said, my voice low but sharp as a blade slicing through the air. "They get so caught up in their power that they forget to check who they're up against. Especially when it's a black woman they think they can easily trample." I picked up the wooden gavel she'd dropped, the one she'd once used to sentence my home to death, raised it high and slammed it down on the table. "Meeting adjourned." The clink of handcuffs rang through the room as the FBI led Karen and her counsel away. The crowd of neighbors erupted in applause, years of fear and oppression finally dissolving. Karen's piercing scream, "You can't do this to me," was drowned out by the sound of justice being served. As I gathered my evidence, old Mrs. Viola Hensley from across Cedarstone Street approached and hugged me, tears streaming down her weathered face. "We should have stood with you," she whispered, her voice choked with regret. I hugged her tightly, my eyes following Karen as she was escorted to the police car. "Sometimes," I said softly, "justice has to take the long road to make sure it lands where it's needed, especially when the enemy thinks someone like me doesn't deserve it." The morning of the trial dawned heavy, the air thick with a stifling difference. I stood before my bathroom mirror adjusting my judge's robe, recalling Karen's mocking laughter as my house burned. Now she wasn't laughing anymore, and I'd make sure she never would again. The courtroom was packed, neighbors, reporters, and victims from other neighborhoods stepping into the light after our story hit local news. Karen entered clad in an expensive suit instead of her usual yoga gear, but her face was deathly pale when she saw me on the bench. I'd never forget the moment she grabbed her lawyer's arm, her trembling voice whispering, "It's her. That black bitch whose house we torched." Her lawyer dropped his pen, hands shaking too hard to pick it up. The evidence we presented silenced the courtroom. The investigation had uncovered 18 other homes mysteriously burned after rejecting Karen's HOA over the past 9 years. The pattern was consistent: relentless harassment, blatant sabotage, then sudden fires. They bought the charred lots for next to nothing through a shell company run by Karen's brother-in-law, raking in tens of millions from corruption and the blood of innocents. We played my security footage. The courtroom held its breath as Karen and her crew were shown spreading gasoline around my grandmother's sunflower garden at 1:45 in the morning. Karen shook her head frantically, mouthing no in desperation as her own voice blared through the speakers. "Once it burns, that bitch will have to sell cheap. No one wants that black trash here." Those words weren't just evidence of a crime, they were a confession of the deep-seated hatred aimed at me, at my identity. The surprise blow came when Rufus, the ex-sheriff once loyal to his wife, turned on her. He'd stayed silent out of duty, but faced with undeniable evidence, he crumbled. He spilled everything: how they'd meticulously planned, how they'd targeted victims, especially people of color and immigrants, and how they'd bribed local officials to blind justice. Karen screamed, "Traitor!" at a deafening pitch, forcing 2 bailiffs to drag her out, her high heels scraping the floor like the claws of a cornered beast. One by one, victims stood to tell their stories. Mrs. Dolores Fuentes, a retired teacher who lost family heirlooms in a fire, the Siddiqui family whose grandfather's ashes were destroyed in rubble. Each account was a dagger, making Karen shrink in her seat, her pricey suit unable to hide the raw fear in her eyes, the fear of someone finally realizing their power had vanished into smoke. As I delivered the verdict, my voice never wavered: Karen Holiday, 28 years in prison. Each council member, 18 years. Their faces registered horror. They finally understood no amount of money could buy an escape from justice. No excuse could erase the crimes they'd committed against people like me. Karen tried to stand, stammering a speech about protecting neighborhood values from misfits, but I slammed the gavel down, cutting her off as she'd once dismissed my pleas about my grandmother's garden. "Enough," I said, my voice like thunder. "You've lost. That was 9 months ago. Today, I stand watching the construction crew put the finishing touches on my reborn Victorian home. The emerald green paint shines just as my grandmother once mixed it by hand, and the sunflower garden is reviving from the last cuttings that survived the flames. Karen's house was auctioned off to compensate victims, now home to a lovely immigrant family. Their kids play on the lawn where Karen once stood, snapping photos of my violations, their laughter ringing out as the perfect retort to her hatred. New neighbors formed a true community alliance, not an HOA, but a group united in support where no one is judged by skin or background. We held a neighborhood potluck in my garden, everyone bringing food and stories. Yesterday, Mrs. Dolores brought her famous tamales and showed off family photos her daughter had salvaged from the ashes. Sometimes, while working in the garden, people stop to thank me, not because I'm a judge, but because I dared to stand against a bully, protecting people like them. Local news ran a follow-up story on how we turned a neighborhood Karen once terrorized into a real community. They interviewed the Siddiquis, who now host monthly gatherings in their stunning backyard. I keep Karen's coffee cup on my desk at the courthouse, the one she dropped when she realized who I was. It reminds me that justice can be slow but certain, just as my grandmother always said. Each morning, I sip coffee in my sunflower garden, watching the sunrise through perfect emerald-trimmed windows, knowing that sometimes the sweetest revenge is rebuilding something more beautiful than what was destroyed and thriving. Despite every enemy who wanted to erase me for being who I am. The story of Zora Ellison and Karen Holiday also reflects pressing issues in today's society: abuses of power, corruption, and racial prejudice still quietly weaving through communities. From it, I've learned this: patience, knowledge, and faith in justice can transform those who seem powerless into mighty warriors, defending not just themselves but the values worth cherishing. However, please note that this story is for entertainment and educational purposes only, not intended to discriminate, criticize, or offend any individual or organization. Any similarities are purely coincidental. What do you think of this journey? Leave a comment below with your thoughts. Don't forget to like, share the video, and subscribe to the channel to explore more meaningful stories together. Thanks for watching this video to the end. Wishing you a peaceful day and see you in the next videos.